Good evening once again, everyone. I'm glad to welcome you tonight to this conversation between Mark Dion and Kristýna and Marek Milde. The three of them know quite, I would say, even very well. They met a long time ago in New York. When I was thinking about organizing a conversation with Mark Dion, I thought it would be a dream to have them together speaking, because not only are they friends, but they have quite a lot in common artistically. I will tell you briefly, I will introduce them briefly. So, first of all, Mark Dion, you have earned international recognition for your complex installations inspired by the Wunderkammer. In your practice, you explore humanity's relationship with the natural world through the construction of knowledge and scientific discourses. You have compared the mission of your work to the mission of a museum. Both offer means to gain knowledge through things. Your intentions are quite different, though. Institutional critique with a great deal of humor being an integral part of your methodology and presentation strategy. You are the recipient of many awards. You have fulfilled commissions and had exhibitions at museums all over the world, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Tate, and the Natural History Museum in London, Minneapolis Institute of Art, Whitechapel Gallery, ICA Boston, among many others. You are also a co-director of Mildred's Lane, a visual art education and residency program in Beach Lake, Pennsylvania. Kristýna and Marek Milde, you are originally from Prague and based in New York since 2008? 3. In your practice, you investigate the shifting relationship between culture and environment, often using natural and man-made found materials to create interpretative archives, sculptures, and site-specific installations. Together, you have been awarded numerous residencies and awards and have exhibited internationally in institutions such as the Queen's Museum and MoMA in New York, the Dock Center for Contemporary Art, Futura, and Meat Factory in Prague, among others. Needless to say that we were very much looking forward to having you in Prague. It was not so easy to get you here, so thank you for being at the Kunsthalle and spending this moment with us, knowing that you arrived all the way, the three of you, from the US just a few days ago. My first question is for you, Mark. Let's start with the reason which brings you to Prague, a site-specific installation which relates to the history of the former Danger station. Can you tell us to what extent the Prague Cabinet of Electrical Curiosities is comparable to other cabinets you made elsewhere, and what is the specificity of this one?
Okay. Hello, is that working? Oh, great. This is a very special moment for me because this really represents 3 years of work that we've been developing this project. Not always an easy road, largely not because of our relations. We've had a remarkably positive time in putting this together, but because of COVID and other factors that made this work. It had to be very uniquely constructed because of my inability to actually be here on location to find the objects. The work is really very much about a nod to the history of the building as an electrical transfer station, but also the very curious history of what happened to the building afterward, right? So the building had another life after it was a curator, after it was a transfer station. It was an unofficial club. There were people squatting here. And so when you look at the cabinet and you see that not all of these objects are electrical in nature, some of them are really quite curious. Those might come from some of the other lives that happened here. So the work has a much deeper understanding of how this building functioned than just the transfer station. For me, I spent a lot of time looking at museums. I'm a very passionate collector. I spend a lot of time with other collectors. And one of the things I learned from when I looked at museums is I try to find out what works and what in the display techniques and technologies are really successful. And as an artist, I borrow or steal some of those. So for me, one aspect of that was the discovery of the cabinet itself as a medium. So can we show some other images?
Yes.
So I'll just flip through a variety of different cabinets. So I understood the way that cabinets function within museums as a sort of taxonomical, indexical structure that could hold a variety of materials, could create new meanings through the juxtaposition of elements. Next, please. So these are from some of the earliest cabinets made in the mid-1990s, and this is actually the most recent cabinet before this one that was made in South Korea just weeks ago. And so the cabinets have various scales. I'm working with different kinds of materials because a lot of my work is about the history of natural history. A lot of the cabinets, reflect the institutional understanding of what gets to be called nature at a particular time for a particular group of people, but other times these cabinets can be very precise in their focus. This is a cabinet that represents elements that I collected in the Pacific garbage gyre. This is a giant area of floating plastic garbage that is in the North Pacific Ocean that dumps vast amounts of the world's plastic trash onto remote islands in Alaska. So all of this material are from islands in Alaska where there really are no people and never have been people, but they are filled with plastic trash. A lot of the cabinets have a very humorous nature. Next slide. Oops. Oh, the one before that. Oh, somehow I got lost there. I'm looking for the one called Sea Life.
Yes, this one.
Oh, yes. So this is a very beautiful colored cabinet called Sea Life. It's reminiscent of the kind of extraordinary marine organisms that you find in the ocean, things like nudibranchs and anemones and soft-bodied invertebrates. But when you actually look at the things in the jars, you find that they're either dog toys or sex toys. The cabinet has really become, I think, one of my essential forms, and in some way, I think it's part of my largest sort of contribution to the progress of art, in a sense, the notion of using these cabinets to construct arguments.
Yeah, and the three of you share a similar passion for the natural world. You constantly explore. You are collectors, rescuers of found objects, observers of human behavior, and what is also fundamental in your practice is the idea of collaboration. Now, a question to you, Kristýna and Marek. Once you told me that your first encounter with Mark Dion was through art. Can you remind us in what circumstances you had this discovery and tell how it influenced your own practice?
So I think it was the project Thames Dig in London, and sometimes in the early 2000s, has been 2003, I think, and we were on a way from Prague to New York and stopped in London to see museums and galleries, and the day we were on our way to see the Tate Modern, and we went along the banks of Thames River, and so there was a low tide. And we were really excited because like the whole river banks were exposed, so we climbed down the ladder to the riverbed and walked through the stones towards the museum. And at that moment, we found something really interesting because between the stones and pebbles, there were many objects to be found. From very recent trash to sort of like historical artifacts or parts of old jars and undefinable objects. I remember I was really fascinated by these bricks which were like washed down by the river, 2 small pebbles, and they look like stones. So we collected full bag of these treasures and arrived at the museum sort of soaked and muddy, and I think we left like wet traces on the museum floor, just to being totally blown away by Mark Dion's piece, The Thames Dig, which was a cabinet of curiosities based on the collection from the Thames River. And we were very excited and realized we share like really similar interests and sensitivities to objects and environment. And at the time we didn't have like many environmental artists around us, and we were like, we really have to meet this artist one day because we would have a lot to share. And luckily we did. I'm very happy we met Mark at a later date.
I can't figure out exactly when we met, but I think it must have been, it's either 2006 or 2008. I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, I think we came to one of your presentations at the Queen's Museum, which was a presentation of the your documentary about the Mildred's Lane by the Art 21 or something.
Yes, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think we met there. And then later at the Tanya Bonagdar, where I as an art handler was part of the team to help you make the octagonal room, which is also an amazing project. Yeah.
But then you invited us to the Mildred's Lane, and that's how the magic started.
Yeah.
And we discovered this incredible place, which you will see later. But that's, that's kind of a home for us in the New York state.
I think even though New York is a very crowded city of artists, the artists who do things that overlap and the artists who share interests and passions find each other.
Yes, actually it's a good way to introduce my third question, a question to you, Kristýna Marek, again. I would like to tell us about a project looking for a home that you developed in 2011 and which is directly inspired by your first months in New York. At that time, while walking in the streets of the city, you were overwhelmed by the accumulation of objects that seemed to be everywhere in the streets.
Yes, exactly. We arrived in New York with 2 backpacks and had to furnish our first apartment. And growing up in the communist Czechoslovakia, of course, everything was recycled here. You couldn't find things thrown away the way in Germany, where we also lived for 7 years, or in New York, people do. And so many still functional objects are discarded on the street, including some, museum pieces like first Česká chair from Marcel Breuer, or some like beautiful leather sofa. And so we were invited by the Queen's Library to create a site-specific project. And so we decided that we will create a lounge for the students to study, which will be solely furnished with found objects. And so we started with completely white walls, and over the period of 1 month, we gradually added pieces to the installation. We had people requesting, like, can you bring some more books or a blanket? And it became really like a nice dialogue. We also created a map with all the objects we found. Mostly we were looking in Manhattan, and we found really like things like from clothing to furniture to diploma of somebody's from Pennsylvania University. And this whole kind of a notion started also our interest in discovering the stories behind the objects. Because by seeing how the objects were discarded, you could tell so much about the person. So we were not interested in the object itself, but what is behind it. And that's, I think, what we share with Mark. It's, the object is only like the placeholder for a story or a theme which you as a viewer can discover. Maybe the next slide. And then we created a catalog. It's me without the shoes, a few years younger. And it's in a form of an IKEA catalog. We use the same keywords like the spring collection 2011 to kind of create a contrast to the ever-changing novelty items which you are supposed to buy, in contrast to objects which you keep for generations and have a personal story for you.
I think we share the sensibility of the flaneur, the wanderer through the city who just kind of wanders around. But unfortunately, we also share the sensibility of the scavenger. So it becomes very complicated when you're wandering around the city, but you also want to collect everything you find. Right. So it's nice that you now have a baby, because the baby carriage will help you collect much more.
That was the latest step.
Exactly. And it's this kind of investigation is to me like a form of ethnographic research. You probably have a lot to say about what you found and what you learned during this research that probably was unexpected. Could you tell us a little bit about the behavior of people, maybe through the objects, and you travel in different countries, and especially you, Mark, but you also have been living in several places. So what kind of comparisons you can find out through the objects you find?
You want to go first?
Well, I mean, speaking specifically in this project, what excited me was the looking at objects that for the electrical cabinet was that there were these extraordinary materials, right? So we have these materials that resist electricity, that don't transmit. So we have ceramic and glass and bakelite, and the presence of bakelite. Bakelite is quite rare in the United States, and here it's just in incredible abundance. It's like going somewhere and finding there's gold nuggets lying on the streets. So, that kind of material specificity for me is one of the most interesting aspects of doing a project like this, where we're really looking at this period in the 1930s when the building is first used, where bakelite is really the primary object of domestic electronics. So things look and feel very different than contemporary electronics. And that was, for me, like one of the most satisfying aspects of putting this collection together. So that everything is designed beautifully. The materiality is very beautiful. And it's very alien from domestic electronics today.
Yeah, I think like difference between maybe the Europe or Prague and New York, it's like the consumerist cycles in New York City. It's very, very fast, and people don't have space or so much space to accumulate stuff, so they throw it out. And also, one of the reasons we decided to work with objects we found on the streets, it's that for us as a European, it's striking the way of the garbage disposal in New York City, because most of it, in here we have everything neatly disposed in cans and it's hidden and it disappears. In New York City, the garbage goes into black bags, which are put on the street and are taken away, and then whatever doesn't fit, it goes on top. So you actually can see incredible pieces of furniture, some of them very valuable or not broken at all, or not in a state one would like consider them like a reason for disposal. And after the first project, we follow the story of objects specifically. So we focused on variety of themes. We collected chairs, which are very easy to be found and very often. However, one of our other favorite objects were books. And finding on books on New York City street is very interesting because there was in a time where sort of people thought like we won't be reading anymore, which didn't happen, but people were getting rid of books. And usually books are found in series or as a collection. Very rarely there is one book to be found. And interestingly, I think books is just like objects people feel sorry about to throw out. So often they place them neatly on a doorstep or somewhere and hope somebody will take these books. And for us, it was like a research of a human mind, because we accumulated hundreds of books, and they were in collections as we found them, and they later became an archive, which we transformed, what we called public library. And the public library, it's a bookcase, it's a library made just from the found books. Each cabinet shape of the bookcase is made to the size of the collection we found, and together they create this irregular structure, which somehow also recalls the architecture. In any case, we thought about these books thematically. They are kind of like a portrait of somebody or as a person who got rid of these books or stories at the moment, and they're kind of like a curated selection for discarding. And we thought like it's an interesting testimony about our culture. What ideas are going away? What we don't need? What does disappear? And this piece was shown in the public space and was available to people. And yeah. Yeah.
And Marek, you told that most of the time the books are thrown together, like there are few of them, never anyone throw one book at once. But there was one exception. Can you tell us what it was?
Oh, yeah, that was the Bible, which was very strange. It was in front of the church, and there was one Bible. It was still readable, so we kept it.
Yeah, I think, when I visit a place, I always want to understand the official story of how a place thinks about itself. So you go to the History Museum and you get the official story of how a society wants to present itself. But when you want to get the unofficial story, when you want to get the subconscious of a society, you go to the garbage dump or you go to the flea market. And that's when you get to really know what a society values, what they care about, what's important to them, what is current and what is passé.
Yeah, and Mark, you go to the flea market, but you go also to the beach.
Yeah.
So can you tell us about this project, which is more plastic-oriented than the Cabinet of Electrical Curiosities?
Yes, I mean, I've done a lot of projects where I'm collecting what other people don't want, and specifically plastic garbage that washes up on the oceans. This is, on this beach, this is an extremely remote island off of the coast of Alaska. And it's a place where there are no people whatsoever, and there have never been people. But when you approach the beach, it is absolutely covered with trash from Mexico, from the United States, from Canada, from Russia, from India, from China, from Japan. And it all ends up years later on these beaches in Alaska. So, these objects are really interesting because they're designed to attract us, right? There's an army of product designers and colorists and commodity producers making these things for us. And undoubtedly, they still retain their desirability. They still capture our eye, even though they're long past their use. So when you put them together, they become an incredibly seductive visual statement.
Yeah, the fate of things, their afterlife is indeed an important concern for you, Mark. And just as crucial is the role of the viewer. In a recent interview, you said, "I want the viewer to be a detective at a crime scene. I want them to arrive and ask what it is about." Does it apply to all the works you make?
I do think a lot about the viewer. I mean, the viewer is my partner in making an artwork. It doesn't exist, the artwork doesn't exist without the viewer. So, and I want to put the viewer in the driver's seat. The difference between art museums and science museums is that in a science museum, you are a passive consumer of information, right? You can't really disagree with what they say. You're just consuming knowledge in a very cut and dry way. When you walk into an art museum, it's not assumed that you will like everything you see. In fact, it's quite okay to not like things. And that role of having a viewer who is critical, who is thoughtful, who may disagree with the way things are done, is an important element for me. I want to try to find a way to make the viewer an active participant in the construction of a work.
Yes, an example where the viewer has a very interesting position is the field of station of the melancholy marine biologist. Can you explain a little bit this work?
I do a lot of work that are outdoor works that take the function of a kind of folly, of a diminutive bit of architecture that doesn't have a particular practical purpose, but rather it has the purpose of generating meaning. And some of these the viewers can enter, and some of them the viewer just looks through the window. In this case, the viewer looks through the window and experiences a laboratory of a marine biologist who is at the point of discovering that there's just no good news coming from the ocean. So it's a very melancholic, a very sad scenario, in a sense, that the viewer is placed in the situation of being a sort of voyeur, of being someone who is peeking through these windows and surveying a rather desperate situation.
I know that for you too, Kristýna and Marek, the viewer is an important part of your work, like this, your interaction with him, and what role is your ideal viewer supposed to play?
So we definitely like to invite people into our installations. Maybe you could go show the homescape, and to create kind of a situation where the viewer won't be just a viewer, but be part of the project, and where assume different roles, from librarian, florist, or gardener, and we also often like to seat people into situation, because like right now you are sitting and you are kind of like contemplating different topics, rather than if people are just walking through a gallery and having 2 seconds to see a painting. So we like to create a situation where you will feel comfortable and can start to think about different objects and topics. So, for example, this project was done at Wave Hill in 2014, and the people can really sit down and experience the nature inside of domestic space. The pieces can also travel, so in winter time they could be inside, where you cannot go outside so much, and during the summer they could be installed outside. We often are trying to kind of bridge the problems of our urban cities where we are really alienated from the environment, especially in New York. And so most of our projects are kind of bringing the nature back into our life. So maybe you could show the carpet piece too. The one before maybe. Yeah. So this is a project we have now installed at the Moka Westport, and these are again all found plants, tropical plants. We found discarded on the street, so we rescued them, kept them for a number of years, and now they finally found their home. Although the carpet is flying to kind of signify the way how the tropical forests are disappearing, but also how the plants were discarded from the new apartments, and so people can sit on it and experience this kind of tropical garden at home.
At the beginning of the discussion, you said that you met Mark in real life after you met him through his work, in relation with his educational project, Mildred's Lane. So can you remind this moment, or maybe Mark, you can start speaking about this project, which exists for almost 20 years, maybe a little bit more now. So yes, please.
Yeah. Well. I mean, Mildred's Lane is a 100-acre site in rural Pennsylvania. It's a site that has a number of buildings, both old and new, and a number of smaller buildings. And it's a kind of experimental artist residency. It's more like a think tank, I think, than a traditional artist residency. And the impetus for Mildred's Lane to develop was that Morgan Pewitt, who's the co-founder and really the current director of Mildred's Lane, and I noticed that art schools were becoming impossibly boring. They were becoming impossibly constrained. They were being run by administrators and lawyers instead of artists. And the things that we did with our professors, which were so formative for us, you wouldn't just be fired for now, you would be put in jail for. So how do you continue to introduce younger artists into the culture of being an artist, but really just get rid of the institution of art school altogether? And so we created a living, working residency program which brought not only visual artists, but also architects, landscape architects, poets, writers, scavengers, alternative people of many different types together to work on developing different programs, different classes that could explore non-traditional ways of thinking about these things. It still has a very disciplined structure where you have mentors or teachers who develop a topic, and then maybe 8 to 10 students can come and co-develop a topic together. It's not the kind of residency where you come and you're given a deluxe cushy space and someone knocks on your door at noon and delivers a lunch to you. It's a place where everyone works and everyone kind of co-makes this place together. So it's a really exciting, dynamic space, a little bit based on maybe like a Black Mountain College model or some kind of fragment of the Bauhaus model.
Yes, and tell us your experience.
Yeah, I would have to say, like, Mildred's Lane is a place in my heart, and I think, like, being able to be at Mildred's Lane certainly make our presence in the new world easier, made us feel more at home, and gave us a hope, because at that place magic happens, and as Mark mentioned, the city people will arrive. However, the same people who are in this city, stressed out and competitive and hard art world in New York City, is a very tough place. at Mildred's Lane, these people open up and actually communicate in a very different way. So interaction happens like in a place nowhere else. And visiting the place is a holistic experience because the Mildred's Lane has its rules and the way of life. It's very specific, going around the very well-designed main house, but mostly people live in small shelters, which each of them, it's actually an artist project. Many of these shelters, say like a bird blind, is a project of Mark Dion. There are many more very interesting places to stay, and one has the opportunity to live inside of an artwork, which is incredible.
Yeah, there's a lot of great things about New York City, but New York City can also really suck. I mean, it's incredibly hard to meet other artists. People are really not very generous, and there's just a lot of people who are super uptight and really stressed and, as you said, competitive. And so to try to create a situation that's not so far from that, but really breaks down a lot of that New York City armor is a big part of the goal.
And part of it is the 2-kilometer long driveway, which is four-wheel ride. So you really enter into wilderness, although it's not that far from the city. It really feels very remote, and you could just get lost there. Now there is a pond, so there is no reason to leave, really, and just having a nice meal and great discussions, which always happen there, long into the night.
I really recommend you look further into it because the program has grown over 20 years. It's really interesting, and there are ways to plug in. It'd be great to have more artists from here and there.
Yes, the time is going fast, and I'd like you to have the possibility to ask questions to our guests. So I have just one last question. And then, please do not hesitate. I'm sure there are so many interesting things to say about their work, but maybe also afterwards, during this reception, you'll have the time to speak with each of them. But for now, my last question, which is related to the reason we are here tonight, the Cabinet of Electrical Curiosities, a question that I'm sure many of us would like to ask to Mark. What is your favorite object in this cabinet?
Wow. I have a lot of favorite objects because I love practical porcelain. I love the look of it, and I love bakelite. But there are two objects that I think really resonate with me. One is just a tiny little lever switch, and it's really tiny. It's probably 5 centimeters. And it's just this tiny little lever that it's electricity off, electricity on, electricity off, electricity. But it's so miniature, and I think the piece that really functions in an interesting way for me is a pair of very worn, very kind of impoverished shoes that sit on top of the cupboard. And those are something that was left in this building. It's so remarkable that somehow these shoes survived. And they are so weird, but they're so warm and humanizing of the entire project. I feel like they have... they may not appeal to me so much aesthetically, but the gravity of them in the piece itself, they have a lot of importance. And they really do orient the piece, I think, in a really productive and unpredictable way.
And the same question to you, even if I know that you didn't have time to look very much in detail because you discovered the cabinet tonight with all of us, but maybe you already have one favorite object.
It's obvious that we really think alike because my favorite objects are the shoes.
Let's choose win.
But exactly because it kind of creates the presence of maybe the electrician or, like a skeleton or maybe, it's your size. So it really gives the presence of the viewer or the maker or, it introduced the human element. So that was my pick.
Yeah. They personify.
Yeah, they personify the whole piece. So it kind of almost like a signature. Yeah.
All right. I think I am more into the real electrical objects. I was really amazed to see some of these switches or the facets, sockets actually, which have some like anthropomorphic forms. So some of them have eyes, some of them may have a mouth, and despite those are really carrying like a high voltage, they are very human-like. And, feels electrifying for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so thank you very much. It was such a pleasure to have this conversation with you. And now I'd like to take some questions from the audience. I hope we have a microphone somewhere. Maybe.
Question?
Yes, there is one here.
Who was it?
Yeah, someone else on the right.
Thank you. My name is Katka. Nice meeting you all. Mark, I just have a nice view at the closet and I see a real wooden closet there. And I can imagine I come here with my daughter and she will ask me, Mom, what is inside the closet? So did you prepare some surprise there for a little curious soul like children are?
That's a really, really good question. It's funny because I was just judging a prize for young sculptors, and so I chose 10 sculptors, and one of them created a piece that she used an old drawing table with many drawers as the pedestal for her piece. And the drawing table was amazing. And I looked in the drawers, and they were empty. And I thought, she does not get the prize. Because I don't want people to open the cupboard, but you can bet there's something in the cupboard if people do. Because I know that they will. And the cupboard is, I think, well curated. Your daughter would not be disappointed.
That's the secret forever. Okay, thank you.
Hello, thank you and congratulations for the work. Not just to you, Mark, also to the Kunsthalle team. And I wanted to ask you, first of all, I wanted to tell you that I was very impressed by your work in the Drawing Center in New York City in 2017, which I found it like a huge installation where I was a little bit struck by the presentation because I thought that it was a little bit ethnographic, but we can continue talking about that later. And here I was very curious about one of the signs that you have on the wall that is, I think it's in Portuguese. So I was wondering about the origin of that sign in the context of that research and that looking for electrical context in this, in this land, in this place, in this city. So I was just very curious about it.
Yeah, I think that again, this project was made perhaps differently than had we not been working during this COVID period, in which I would have been more here, spending a lot of time in flea markets and junk stores. But luckily, I had Madge, who was amazing, who has the greatest sensibility of any shopper I've ever worked with, who could really anticipate what kinds of things I was looking for and really never made a bad move. It was just a kind of genius in terms of being able to put together the kinds of things I was interested in. At the same time, I was still collecting wherever I was. And so there are a couple things about the cabinet that are very different from that I want to emphasize. And one is that I'm not a historian of technology. and I'm not a true archaeologist in a sense. So I don't want to tell the same stories that the Museum of Technology is going to tell, right? And the Museum of Technology, I'm sure, does an excellent job of telling about the evolution of electricity. And so my job is not to recapitulate what they do. And my job as an artist is not necessarily to tell the truth, right? So you can only take my word for it about where these objects are found and what they are. But I think you should never take the word of an artist, to be honest. So there are objects in there that should perhaps disrupt the all too simple narrative of what that piece is, right? And I think you put your finger on one of them.
One or two last questions. So yes, please.
So thank you so much for everything you've shared with us. It's been fascinating. And there's one aspect that I'm still really curious about, and you've all been speaking about the importance of the viewer and the human factor, or bringing humanity into your art. And especially when you were speaking about Mildred's Lane, the concept of community was coming to my mind repeatedly. And so I was just wondering what role the idea or the concept of community plays in your practices, if that's something that you think of when you're going through the creative process, if one of its aims is to build community and relationships amongst people, and to perhaps spark conversations between individuals that wouldn't have necessarily spoken otherwise.
I would say, just like from experience working with Mark, the sense of community in the groups of people and assistants he is working with this project, it's great. It's incredible. Mark works on large-scale projects which calls for sometimes for large teams of people in a collaborative effort, and he's excellent in creating this like very non-hierarchical community-like spirit. So yeah, that was my experience to work with Mark. And
we always like to have people directly involved in our projects. And to kind of help them create it. So one of the examples would be the project Home in a Home, where we had people answer questionnaires about their favorite objects they have at their homes and what they have for non-functional objects, in a sense, not like a bed, but, souvenirs or objects from their travel. And it's interesting how Mark was describing the project about the plastic pollution, that it was coming from all over the world. We also had participants from over all the continents telling us stories about what creates the feeling of home. And after we had like hundreds of responses, we saw a pattern which repeated itself, and decided to create a wallpaper with all the stories people told us. And I have to also say that while we were doing the installation, we always had like an office where people could fill out the questionnaire, but if we were there, they always were talking and sharing the stories of objects with us. And finally we created a room of stories where people could read different objects, but also participate. And what I would say was interesting, that it didn't matter if the people were from Asia or from Africa or from USA. The objects we cherish are always the one which connects us to other people, to your grandparents, to your parents, loved ones, or places. And so I think that this sense of community, it's so important in this kind of fragmented times, especially after Corona.
And I have to say that I was extremely fortunate in this project, because there is a community here. There is an entire museum team, but they just don't have a museum yet. So I got all the love. So I got the education people and the project managers and the wonderful curator who was only focused on me, and our lovely director. So and there's only one other time I did that, which was the Thames Dig, because I made that piece in 1999, the year before the Tate opened. So they had all of their people all lined up and ready to go. They just didn't have a project. So it was very similar here. And you know, this museum has an incredible team that's just revved up and ready for this building to get finished. And I think it's going to knock everyone's socks off when it's going to be an extraordinary space when things get going.
I have to say, we like to be compared to the Tate Modern, so let's end here.